Oui, voilà, il paraît qu'on ne m'entendait pas. Donc là, je vois que ça s'est déjà regroupé, très bien, pour optimiser un petit peu optimiser les places.
Pour les étudiants qui n'ont pas de place, vous pouvez venir vous installer sur la partie bétonnée à côté. Bon, c'est bétonné, mais c'est confortable quand même. Et on va essayer de ramener des chaises et de créer un nouveau rang là-bas. Merci. Vous pouvez aussi vous asseoir par terre exceptionnellement. Désolé, hein.
Vous avez bien bossé. Il y a des écoles qui n'ont pas respecté le cahier des charges.
Moi je sais, non mais c'est chez nous.
C'est toi.
Ah bah
voilà.
tu dis à 100, tu dis à 100 de venir, il y en a 40.
C'est toujours pareil. C'est toujours pareil.
Voilà, c'est trop putain. Bon. Allez, oui, bonjour. Je pense qu'on va pas le faire. Bon, et les épithéens. On stoppe le pointage.
micros, c'est juste pour l'enregistrement ou ils diffusent dans la salle aussi?
Normalement, les 3 micros sont ouverts, je crois.
There's nothing you can ask me that will bother you. Good. That's what I'm saying. We make it
Oui, Emmanuel. Micro-cravate, faut rentrer dans la salle aussi, mais juste pour l'enregistrement. Non, il faut qu'il y ait ça. Alors, son micro-cravate, apparemment, c'est juste pour l'enregistrement.
D'accord, ok. You need to have also one.
Okay.
Emmanuel n'arrive pas?
Petite photo de
Emmanuel?
Chloé. La banane. Hop. Merci.
Okay, so it's a pleasure, it's an honor for us to welcome Mr. Alec Ross. Thank you for coming. You are in one of the temple of higher education and research on most of the subjects that you will present. So really you are at the best place, at the right place for this student, and I will be very happy to see your presentation and to ask maybe some question at the end of your presentation. Thank you for coming. And I introduce Mr. Mark Drilesh, who is General Manager of Ionis Education Group, to present this conference.
C'est un Q, mister. Merci beaucoup. Few words in French. C'est fini maintenant. En anglais. So, hello. Let's start this exceptional meeting with a big welcome to Alec Ross. When I received the book the day before the launching in France, I delivered in 40 hours, and I annotated almost 1 page on 2. I called Florence de Veza and Philippe Adam, the editors, the publishers, and asked them if by miracle you decide to come to France, please come to see the Kremlin Bicêtre, because this is the best place in France. You have other places, but first you go to what we call in French the KB.
Okay.
The KB, okay? So Alec Ross is a visiting professor at King's College London and the author of The Industry of the Future, which has been translated into 24 languages and been a bestseller on 4 continents. He is a board partner at Emplo, global venture capital firms, and sit on the boards of directors and advisors for companies in the field of technology, finance, education, human capital, and cybersecurity. He has served as Distinguished Senior Fellow at the Johns Hopkins University and Senior Fellow at the Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs. During the Barack Obama administration, he served as Senior Advisor in Innovation to the Secretary of State's role created for him to help modernize the practice of diplomacy and bring innovative solutions in advanced American foreign policy. He served also as the convener for the Technology and Media Policy Committee on Barack Obama 2008 presidential campaign. I have prepared 45, 60 questions. I will try to be shorter. I will ask few questions and then I will let everyone to ask questions. If we can have 5-6 hours, it will be great. My first question is, when we read your book, in fact, I don't know if you know, you have 2 books in one. The first one is, but we have planned if I let you talk before I ask a question.
I'll talk for like 2 minutes. So go. All right, good afternoon, everybody. So, look, I feel like I do have to say something at the very beginning on behalf of America, an America that has brought the world Donald Trump. I'm sorry. So, as you heard from that very generous introduction, I think of myself as coming from Barack Obama's America and not from Donald Trump's America. but I will go back there to try to defeat him in a few years. But the topic of today is innovation. It's the industries of the future. Regardless of what our political futures are, we are going to have an economic future, we're going to have a technological future, we're going to have a scientific future that's going to look very different in 10 years than it is today. And it's going to bring promise, and it's going to bring peril. There's good and there's bad. I'm not a utopian. I don't think that the world is going to be Star Trek, where we all live to be 150 years old, happy, healthy, wealthy, lacking for nothing. But I'm also not a dystopian. I don't think the future is going to be Mad Max. It's going to be good and bad for the next 10 years. And my hope is that people like yourselves who are in school, who are imagining and inventing the future, will focus on maximizing the promise and minimizing the peril of all of this change. You know, I came up with a group of entrepreneurs, of innovators. We made a lot of big changes, but it's really going to be in your hands what comes next. And my view is that as much of the change that's come from technology from the United States, if you read my book, you'll see my view is that what is next is not going to be dominated by the United States. The United States will remain powerful as innovators, but innovation is going to come from more places around the globe. So that's all I wanted to lead with as introductory remarks. When I worked for Obama and when I worked for Hillary Clinton, for 4 years, I was a diplomat. I'm not a diplomat anymore, so ask me undiplomatic questions, okay? Okay, thank you all.
So sad you didn't continue another hour, so I wouldn't have to ask you questions. It would be wonderful.
Got to make you work.
Okay, so I begin. My first
We got to
question
get to their questions.
is innovation is, as always, since 1,000 years, a dark side and a bright side. The fact that innovation is now very driven by digital, change the rules or not?
I mean, we always have to change the rules. I mean, here's the way that I think about it. Land was the raw material of the agricultural age. Iron was the raw material of the industrial age. Data is the raw material of today and tomorrow's economy. So the rules that were set for hundreds of years about land ownership determined who was going to be economically powerful and who was going to be politically powerful. The rules that were set during the industrial age, regulating industry, regulating factories, regulating wages, pensions, determined wealth and well-being. We're now moving into a new phase. And the rules that we set in a world of data, where data is the raw material, will determine wealth and well-being. And if we don't set rules, the rules will be set for us in Silicon Valley. And you know, I know all of these entrepreneurs. I know Mark Zuckerberg, I know Jack Dorsey, I know all of these guys who've started these companies. And in my view, they're very intelligent, but they aren't always wise. And there's a difference between intelligence and wisdom. So that the rules that they're setting are rules based on being very smart engineers, but not necessarily understanding a lot about the world or about politics. And so I do think rules need to be set. But the question is then by who? Because I think that most governments are incredibly stupid when it comes to digital. There are 100 members of the United States Senate. There are 435 members of our Congress. I can't think of 535 people who know less about technology than the members of our Congress. So the question is, if you say, oh yes, we need regulation, but do you really want to give regulation to like Donald Trump and the idiots that work for him? So this is the hard part. If Silicon Valley shouldn't regulate itself, and if people in government don't understand any of what you are studying, how do you set the rules? And so that, I think, is the challenge. I have ideas about that. I have ideas about how to do that. But I'm very wary of Silicon Valley setting its own rules, and I'm very wary of 75-year-old white men in white shirts and red ties who don't do their own email, setting the rules in a world of artificial intelligence, machine learning, robotics, data analytics, genomics. I told you I wasn't a diplomat anymore.
For you, in a few years, you write that the development of the drones or the car without driver will not be determined by the technological feasibility, but by the human acceptance. So does not this really also lead our engineers to a better understanding of societies, of human and their behaviors, beyond the essential technological knowledge and skills?
So I'm a big believer in interdisciplinary learning. In the same way in which we don't want politicians who may understand history or political science setting the rules in engineering, I also think that we don't want people who just understand engineering to make all the decisions in history and political science. So my view is that we need interdisciplinary learning. If you are studying engineering, also try to understand some other fields in the humanities. And if you are in the humanities, try to understand something technical in nature. So a big focus of my own work at the universities where I teach is about trying to bring together the different disciplines. Because if you're studying genomics, for example, creating designer babies through CRISPR, through DNA manipulation and other things, you can study that from a biological perspective, but you also ought to study it from a philosophical perspective, from a moral and ethical perspective. And so I'm very focused on trying to break down some of the walls between academic disciplines.
No traduction. On va pas traduire parce qu'on n'aura pas le temps. It's French. Okay. And I say you continue. Okay. If someone wants to ask questions in French, it's okay. Your directors will be very happy. What does it mean, and especially what are the consequences of what you describe as the weaponization of the code as industry of the future?
So I think that the weaponization of code, the creation of cyber weapons, the weaponization of computer code is the most significant development in conflict since the weaponization of fissile material. The difference is that creating a nuclear bomb requires the scarcest of scarce scientific talents and access to transuranium elements, whereas the creation of very powerful cyber weapons has a much lower barrier to entry. When I worked for President Obama, every now and then I had a phone that was just for work, and every now and then that phone would ring, and I would get a call from the White House Situation Room, and they would say, "Where are you?" And I would say the exact street corner I was on, and they would say, "Wait there." And about 3 minutes later, a van would come, and it would pick me up, and I would get in the van, and the van, depending on what city I was in, would take me to a secure facility. If it was in Washington, I'd go to the White House Situation Room. If I was in New York, I'd go to some of the underground bunkers there. And what was interesting was the longer I was in government, the more times we would have these emergencies based on cyber attacks. And so I'm more of an optimist than a pessimist, but the one area where I do take the darkest view is on cyber conflict. the world has gone from a Cold War to a Code War. You know from the revelations that came from Edward Snowden that the United States has substantial capabilities at the NSA and in other parts of government, weaponizing cyberspace. The Chinese very frequently use cyber weapons to steal intellectual property and to monitor its citizens. And the Russians will use cyber weapons basically to raise hell. And these states have had these capabilities, but what's happening now is the capabilities are going from governments to individuals and groups. And in the same way in which nuclear weapons have only been controlled by governments, and that's part of what's kept us from having a nuclear bomb go off someplace. The problem is that cyber weapons, as they go from states to citizens, will have very different incentives. And so this is an area where I take a rather dark view of the future.
Another area is privacy. When you say our conception of privacy is dead, so is this the end of the nice, beautiful, funny, cool world of secrets, small and little lies, surprises, and so on?
Yeah, I mean, so I do think that privacy, the privacy that I had when I was in university is gone. Thank God we didn't have social media when I was in college. I had lots of fun in college. But that's gone now. And I think that there are going to be a couple different effects. The first is that I do think in a world of everything being captured on video, everything captured on audio, one thing I do think is going to change is it will shift norms. Let me give you an example. When I was a university undergraduate, at a fancy university in the United States, homosexuality was still considered aberrant, scandalous behavior. People are like, oh, that's the gay guy. That's the one. Now, everybody accepts, oh no, it's a significant percentage of the population, right? Norms shifted. Drug use. In 1992, which is not that long ago, Bill Clinton, when he ran for president, it was very controversial, the question. When he had a marijuana cigarette, did he inhale? And people said, if he inhaled, maybe he shouldn't be president. 16 years later, Obama's like, oh, I inhaled. That's the whole point. I did it a lot. I liked it. And oh, by the way, I also snorted some coke. And it was a non-issue in the campaign. What happened? Norms shifted. Norms shifted. So I think that one of the things of all of this information, all of our histories being public, norms will shift. That's a somewhat optimistic view of looking at things. The negative view on this is that I think most of us do want some level of privacy. And it's getting harder and harder to protect that privacy. And when you combine that with cyber conflict, it gets very scary. I'll give you an example from the book. There's a problem, I'll mention it since you're university students. There's been a problem in the United States, and maybe elsewhere, with sexual assault, sexual aggression on college campuses, particularly after people have been drinking. And so somebody developed an app called Good to Go, where the man and the woman, or the man and the man, or the woman and the woman, can practice what's called affirmative consent. So if somebody is saying, yes, I want to have sex, the guy will put it in there, the woman will, affirmatively consent. And it's an iPhone app. There's even an extension that you can blow into that attaches to the iPhone that measures your blood alcohol level when you're doing this. And the idea when they started it was, I guess they thought it was a good idea. This is going to show, whether he said yes and she said yes. So it doesn't become a conflict later. Here's the problem. I read the terms of service for this app, and the app maker has the right to sell the data. Not even anonymized. Not even anonymized. And so they literally can sell data about which bars affirmative consent was taking place in, and by whom. It can be like, oh yeah, Susie practiced affirmative consent 3 times last year at 10:30 p.m., 11:12 p.m., and 11:55 p.m. And imagine if this information is hacked, and if your sexual history suddenly gets published on the web in digital ink that you can't erase. So these are the kinds of things that when you can't erase digital ink, it can be scarring. And so I do think we need to create new regimes for privacy. But the way that we built the internet, it's sort of anti-privacy. I mean, right now, you just automatically hit accept on the cookies. You automatically click the box on the terms of service. You have no idea what it says. I don't read it. And so when you do that, you're surrendering a little bit of your information to people who just want to make money on it or just want to exploit it. And that's okay if you're okay with it. What I want is for people to be informed about what they're giving up in exchange for surrendering the data, in exchange for surrendering the personal information.
Thank you. Beautiful answer. Before I receive any question, before you ask a question, another one, the last one for me is we understand our industries can change favorably the course of our lives, personal and professional. It is not so obvious when we discuss the kind of technologies like Bitcoin and blockchain. So can you help us?
Sure. First, I think it's important, and I imagine most of you know this, there's a difference between Bitcoin and blockchain. You know, blockchain was an innovation that was built into the publishing of Bitcoin. Bitcoin, for those of you who don't know, is a cryptocurrency that first came out in the fall of 2008, developed by either an individual or a collective of individuals who called themselves Satoshi Nakamoto. And the idea essentially was to create a kind of crypto stateless currency. Now, Bitcoin, I think of Bitcoin like one of those search engines from the 1990s that went away. You know, WebCrawler, AltaVista, Lycos. They all went away, but the category of search became more important, and there was something that emerged called Google. Google was actually the 18th search engine. And Google became Google because all the previous versions of search, they in part learned about what wasn't working or what could work better. Bitcoin I don't really think of as a currency because it's not really a store of value. It's not a medium of exchange. You know, you can't go and buy a cup of coffee with your Bitcoin. It's much more of a speculative asset, something that goes up and down and up and down. But the significant innovation in Bitcoin is blockchain. And I imagine most of you know it. What it basically is, it's a cryptographic distributed ledger system. So what it's designed to do is give transparency in asset settlement. Now, one of the shortcomings of Bitcoin, the reason why it hasn't become a truly strong global currency, is because it's rooted in pseudonymity. You do not have real identity authenticated within it. That was part of the goal in creating a stateless currency, was to hide from the state transactions that were taking place. If, however, you use the blockchain technology and you root it in real identity, then it can and should be a way of authenticating humans and enabling trusted transactions in a way that wasn't previously possible. And so just one example that I'll give of this, you know, I think about my father. My father was a lawyer, and all he did, he basically did the same thing for 40 years. He would create great big stacks of paper when somebody would buy or sell a home. And the way that the process you went through if you had to buy or sell a home is you paid thousands of dollars so that a lawyer could sit there and put stamps on pieces of paper in a process that took 2 months. And the idea is that the stamps and the lawyer in the 2 months, it was a process, a very necessarily secure process, because the transaction was worth a lot of money. What blockchain technology could enable, since it's codifying trust, is instead of the buying and selling of a home when the buyer wants to buy and the seller wants to sell, instead of that taking 2 months, it should be able to take 2 hours. And instead of several thousands of dollars for lawyers, it should be able to cost like $50. And so blockchain, Bitcoin, I think, will eventually go to zero. Blockchain will endure. But I do think that there will be a cryptocurrency after Bitcoin that will become sort of the Google of cryptocurrency. It would not surprise me if in 5 years the world's biggest currencies were the dollar, the euro, the yen, the yuan, the pound, and a cryptocurrency none of us have heard of yet. But it would be built on, it would account for some of the flaws that I believe exist within Bitcoin.
The applause is not for me, it's for you. Huh? Okay, question, if there is questions now. Oui, okay. One. Attends, on va peut-être... Attends. On va faire ça bien, on va t'amener le micro.
Hi again. So, talking about norms and rules to define now for our future, I was wondering if you were believing in that singularity point, the point where technology, I mean, especially informatics, becomes so autonomous that it does everything we are doing now. It does it for us, and so if you believe in it, because mathematically it corresponds to a regression, what do you think we should do now? Think about it, because progress is unstoppable.
That's a great question.
Merci.
So look, I mean, if you think about the power of informatics, if you think about the power of artificial intelligence, in the same way in which, for me, the 25 years from 1993 to 2018, that was really the story of digitization. When I think, though, about 2019 to 2029, what's going to be most significant, I believe, is the creation of cyber-physical systems with artificial intelligence at its core. And so I do think, and I do imagine, a world in which more and more of our tasks are automated. The question is, what are the limits of it? What about it is good? What about it is bad? I personally would love for artificial intelligence to take out a lot of the dreariness in life. But what I do want, I want to live in a world where humans are telling the machines what to do, machines are not telling the humans what to do. The question is, who is ultimately in charge, the humans or the machines? In the most optimistic view, you could view the rise of these technologies as part of the progression of humanity. So if you think about it, if you go back a couple hundred years to the agricultural age, the average work week was 6 days. The only day you didn't work was Sunday, the day of our Lord. The average work day was the number of hours of sunlight. As we then transitioned from an agricultural age to an industrial age, the work week went from 6 days to mostly 6 days to mostly 5 days. And instead of it being the number of hours of sunlight, 9 to 14 hours, it became rooted in the concept of the 8-hour workday. the most optimistic people, you know, including Mark Andreessen, for example, believe that when you are in your 30s and 40s, we should have migrated from a 5-day work week of the industrial age to something more like a 4-day work week. And instead of the 8-hour workday being the unit, because of AI doing a lot of the menial tasks in our world, it should go to being more like, I don't know, a 6-hour workday. It's possible. The biggest question is that the net effect of it, or is what the effect of it is AI wipes out just a ton of jobs, and so that the people who are doing the menial work or the non-cognitive routinized work, is that just eliminated, and then do the knowledge workers just work as harder than ever before? So the question about what the norms are going to be decided by you. That's an open question. It's a totally open question. It's going to be tomorrow's citizens and tomorrow's leaders who decide, is this technology something that enables humanity more broadly, or is it something that enables knowledge workers and bluntly punishes the work that would have once been done by humans that's now done by artificial intelligence?
Thank you, Alec. Autre question? Oui?
Hi. You mentioned privacy, and you said that we cannot trust in companies to store them, but you also say that we cannot trust states to store them. So what is your solution?
Yeah. So my solution on this is, it's what's called multi-stakeholder governance. The internet is an example. Have you ever wondered how the internet is governed? Well, the real way in which the internet is governed is at the birth of the internet, before people knew how valuable it was going to be, and before government was really involved in it at a senior level, there was an internet governance construction that is multi-stakeholder. It's through an organization called ICANN. It includes government, it includes academics, it includes civil society, and it includes companies. All four bring different perspectives and strengths. And since the birth of the internet to today, internet governance can be kind of messy, but it works. It works better than it would be if just the companies decided, or if just government decided. There's no perfect solution to this, but what I do think is that on issues like privacy, the solutions are best multi-stakeholder. The problem right now is that there's very little leadership putting that together. So you've got the Silicon Valley groups pushing one model, you've got a Chinese authoritarian model, and then you've got a public sector-led model, and they are not collaborating at all right now. The Chinese have the most uniform model. Silicon Valley right now is trying to create organizations. He was asking about AI. A bunch of the big billionaires in Silicon Valley, Elon Musk, Reid Hoffman, and others, have created this thing called OpenAI, designed to be the standard setter. And they bring lots of experts to it, but it's really controlled by them. So it's not really multi-stakeholder. There's no perfect answer here, but the closest I can get is a multi-stakeholder model. Corporations plus government plus civil society plus academics at the same table sharing governance.
Yes.
Hello. You said in your book that there is no greater indicator of an innovative culture than the empowerment of women, and I'd like to know, how do you think we can achieve this, and especially in fields like engineering, entrepreneurship, that are not really, I would not say made for women, but where women are just starting to get more and more places in. How do you think it would work?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I mean, so yeah, my book is aggressively feminist. And I do believe that the best workplaces are those that are not just dominated by sort of the caricature of the young tech bro white guy, right? I do think that diversity creates the best work cultures, and it creates the best products. And as I mean, look, I was an entrepreneur. I ran tech policy for Barack Obama's presidential campaign. I've always been in this world, and where I'm sort of saying we have to hold ourselves to account is say, why have we created cultures that are so antagonistic to women, where the only way a woman can make it is to act like a guy? And so what I think that means is a couple different things. First of all, you have to bring women in, and not just in marketing. I think it's a bullshit solution when all these companies just say, oh, we've got a senior woman. Look, she's the vice president of marketing. Of course, she's always the vice president of marketing. You have to bring women in to positions of authority on boards of directors, in executive roles. You have to create mentorship programs inside the institutions. You have to have clear rules of the road on issues of harassment inside of organizations. And then I think that there has to be, where we lose a lot of our women is before they become women. So when they're still girls. So if you look at the data, and I'm a geek on this stuff, I guess, if you look at the performance of boys versus girls, they tend to perform at or around the same level until about ages 12 or 13. And then what we see is participation for boys goes up a little, and for girls it tends to go down steeply. So by ages 17 or 18, when people are making their application to university, you have a substantially higher level of applications coming from men as opposed to women. So we really need to focus on those ages, in my opinion, of between 12 and 18, as girls become women, and say, what are those interventions we can make to sustain the interest of women? Now, what's interesting is if you do look at this historically, computer science has not always been dominated by men. If you read Walter Isaacson's book, The Innovators, part of what he points to is the role of women in the early years of computer science. And in fact, in 1982, the percentage of women getting PhDs in computer science was higher than it is today. So it's not that this is an industry that's always been male-dominated and we're trying to say, how can we get women into it? No. If you look at early pioneers in computer sciences in the 1940s, in the 1950s, in the 1960s, if you then look at participation levels in the 70s and 80s, you see that women had a better place. It was in the 90s that we really began to lose numbers. And what happened was the development of a culture which I believe is implicitly hostile to women. And so you have to take all of those steps to completely change the culture. One example that, I've tried to live my own rhetoric. So when I worked at the State Department for Hillary Clinton, I had all these jobs to hire, and everybody wanted those jobs, right? Because they're super cool jobs. And I hired, even though a lot of the jobs were technical, and you would think of like the Silicon Valley tech bro, I was like, who are the best women who could fill these positions? And now, a lot of the women who worked for me at the State Department are some of the most important women in technology in the United States. One woman named Katie Stanton, young woman. She's now on the board of directors of Vivendi, a French company. Katie Dowd, Angela Baker, who now runs a big chunk of Qualcomm. So you have to create this space for women, and you have to put all those policies in place. Otherwise, it's just marketing.
Oui. Hello, Mr. Ross. I have a question. I'm here.
Where's the
Yeah.
Yeah.
I want to talk about cyber attack conflict. You was talking about that, and I want to know how efficient the government and the companies can fight against cyber attacks, and the more in the future we will have cyber attacks, how efficient we can find solutions to find a good way to protect ourselves.
Thank you. If you didn't hear, his question was, how efficient can we be and how efficient can governments be in fighting against cyber attacks? Not very good so far. Not very good so far. So just by way of illustration, when Donald Trump was in Vietnam meeting with the leader of North Korea, as that meeting was taking place, North Korean hackers were attacking the United States. We are not yet good at preventing attacks. What we have been better at is keeping those attacks from causing great damage. So for example, when I was talking earlier about how I'd get, picked up by a van and have to go to the Situation Room, a lot of the time what happened would be hackers would get inside banks, okay? Big banks, but they couldn't get out. So we couldn't protect, it's like a bank robber gets into the vault at Crédit Agricole. He's like, he's in the vault, but as soon as he comes out, we're gonna shoot him. So that's what happened. A lot of the time the hackers can get in, but they can't get out. And so the progress that needs to be made is preventative, helping people from getting in the first place.
Oui. Please. So you spoke a great deal about our privacy and our privacy being threatened today, but you also mentioned earlier Edward Snowden and the revelations that came from him about the NSA being used as a tool for social influence, political intimidation, and diplomatic manipulation through mass surveillance. As a formal government official, I'd like to have your opinion on that, since you're not a diplomat today.
Yeah. So what I would say is the premise of the question, I believe, is inaccurate. So if you look at the Snowden revelations, and if you look at what the NSA actually does, the NSA is not using anybody's information for political manipulation. They aren't using it to find out who's paying their taxes. They aren't using it to find out who's sleeping with who. They aren't using it for diplomatic manipulation. They were using it to prevent acts of transnational terror. So when I was asked, for example, about, WikiLeaks, for example, publish a bunch of stuff, I said, you know what it actually revealed was not mass wrongdoing. It revealed massive right-doing. It showed that our private actions matched our public policies. And the NSA programs that were described by Edward Snowden, some of them I felt went too far. But if you look at what government actually did with the information, it was fairly inconsequential. There were phone conversations that were listened in on of certain foreign leaders that we probably shouldn't have listened in on. But you can read all of those thousands of pages and then sort of ask yourself the question, so what? Doesn't make it right. It doesn't make it right. But at the end of the day, all of those billions of dollars being spent by the NSA, what they were actually doing with the information was focusing on anti-terror. So I think that the most positive thing about the Snowden revelations is it enabled the public to debate whether we wanted the NSA to engage in these practices or not. What it didn't do is, reveal fireable wrongdoing by US government officials doing something that they shouldn't have done. So that's not a view that's universally shared, obviously, but having been inside government, worked with the NSA, and having read every page of the Snowden revelations, as well as some of the things that weren't revealed, which I know, that's what I believe is at the core of it.
Yeah, we're talking about so my question is, because we're talking about tomorrow full of technologies and stuff like this, but what about all the countries who hasn't the possibility to have access to technologies? I don't think that they really think about the tomorrow with a lot of technologies, but a lot of these countries, they're growing super fast, and I think they will represent much more than us in the population. So
yeah. So if we were going to think about technology in developing countries in general, this is a case where I actually take a very optimistic view. Before I went to work for Barack Obama, for 8 years of my life, what I focused on was bringing technology and technology training into poor communities. So that it wasn't just sort of people of middle classes and better who could take advantage of the digital world. I view it as a way of achieving economic and social mobility from people from lower classes, where I grew up in West Virginia, or where I was a teacher in inner city Baltimore. I'm fairly optimistic, and I write a fair amount about this in my book, that in those places that you might not think of as having technology, what's interesting is that digitization is actually taking place pretty fast there. You know, I focus a lot, for example, just in my life and in my work on sub-Saharan Africa. And one of the companies that I work with is called Andela. And we have the view that talent is everywhere, but opportunity is not. Talent is universally distributed, but opportunity is not. And so we had the idea, we said, all right, if we go to places in Africa with a large population and a lot of poverty, you go, you know, Nairobi, Lagos, Kampala, a few other, if we go there and we bring Google engineer class technology training and train young people, will they have the talent to then be able to make a lot of money or make more money than they otherwise were? And so we started this company and we created a rigorous assessment program. And before too long, we had thousands of people going through these training programs. They would literally live on campus for 6 weeks. And what's and because we had relationships with the American Fortune 1000, it wasn't about trying to get people visas to move to Paris and work for a startup or move to San Francisco. We created facilities in Lagos, in Kampala, in Nairobi, so that people could do work there for American companies and make an American wage. And it is shooting through the roof. What we learned was that yes, if you're willing to bring Google class engineering training into Nigeria, into Kenya, the talent is there. And we actually, just about a month ago, we raised $100 million to help us scale this organization. The company's now worth $700 million. And it's not a charity. This is all focused on developing the talent in the developing world. So this is a case where I'm more optimistic, but I recognize that so long as there is a digital gap, it will exacerbate inequality, but I do see the talent everywhere.
Hello. Hello.
Yes, sir.
About the manipulation of data and weaponization of technology, is there any ethical barrier will still not be break in the future for you?
Yeah. Are there ethical barriers in the manipulation of data and in the weaponization of code? Absolutely. I think that anything that would be illegal or unethical in the real world should be illegal or unethical in the digital world. You know, for example, in the manipulation of data, you know, the kind of cyber attack we're most afraid of is called an integrity attack, where it's not just about getting in a system, stealing data, or stealing money and getting out. It's about getting in a system and manipulating the data. So imagine if you went to your bank account and you thought you had 400 euro in there, but you go in there and it's 45. That's what we're worried about, is the manipulation of data. So yeah, I mean, in the same way in which, if you asked a question, are there ethical limits to what could be done in factories during the digital age? Are there ethical limits to what could be done on farms during the agricultural age? Yes. I think there are also limits on what can and should be done with data in the digital age. It's just a new raw material. Land was the raw material of the agricultural age. Iron was the raw material of the industrial age. Data is the raw material of the information age.
And in different chapters of your book, you explain that it will not be possible to create a new Silicon Valley. I was very disappointed. We expected to create a new one just here. So what could be the model for university to get the environment for startups to create something like Silicon Valley?
I don't think, look, Paris is a lot nicer place than Silicon Valley.
He's a dreamer.
No, I just say have a better dream. I mean, Silicon Valley is fine, and but it's a byproduct of 60 years of investment, and 60 years and hundreds of billions of dollars of investment. I would say don't look to Silicon Valley for your model. Create your own model. I think that there are lots of things, for example, about the culture of Silicon Valley that you don't want here, trust me. I do think that if you look at, again, the 25 years from 1993 to 2018, the couple $1 trillion of wealth that were created, a lot of that wealth was concentrated in Silicon Valley, you know, an area about 60 kilometers long, and in Washington State around Seattle, where Amazon and Microsoft are. A thesis of mine is that in this next wave, Silicon Valley and Seattle will still be very relevant, but I do think that there are going to be 10 to 12 places globally, 10 to 12 sort of global foci that will have the highest concentration of the headquarters, of the HQs. And then I imagine if those are the alpha cities, call 10 to 12 alpha cities, and you could guess what some of them are. There will be a lot of competition. Paris will be in competition with Tel Aviv and London and Dubai and Shanghai and New York and Boston. There will be 10 to 12, I believe, alpha cities. But then I believe there will also be 30 to 40 beta cities. So maybe not as many HQs, but some. Workforces, particularly engineering workforces, but not at the HQ. And they will be a part of global supply chains. So if Berlin achieves in becoming one of the alpha cities, I could imagine Munich being a beta city or something like this. But I do think that the hard concentration of wealth creation that's just taken place on the west coast of the United States, I already see that evaporating.
But you describe that great progress has been made in the areas of biotech, genomics, but you also point that there is 3 conditions for success. The first one is great scientists, the second one is research capital, and the third one is a lot of venture capital. Does that mean that the American university monopoly is still there for the next 50, 60, or 100 years?
Yeah, so I think America is incredibly well positioned. I just don't think it's going to be a monopoly. The one thing, if I were to be critical of France for a second, the one thing that you lack right now, in my humble opinion, relative to the United States, is high-risk early-stage capital. If you have a good idea in the US, it doesn't matter who your parents are, it doesn't matter if you have your degree, people will give you millions of dollars to try it. And if you fail, it's not a big deal. They don't over-punish failure. And we'll do it fast. We'll do it really fast. You know, I'm a board partner at a venture capital fund. We have $100 million. We raised a fund of $100 million. We deployed 80 million of it really fast. We're going to make a lot of return on that. And you know, we don't care who your parents are, who your uncle is. We don't care about your social capital. Do you have a good idea? Do you have the character to execute on it? If so, here's a couple $1 million. Let's see how you go. This is what's missing in France.
Not only.
Yeah, not only.
Because you say one of the reasons of the stagnation stems in France the fact that young professionals are forced to wait decades before being given real responsibilities.
That's right. So if you are in your 20s, it's really hard to get real responsibilities or to meet with powerful people. I mean, look, you know, Mark Zuckerberg raised enormous amounts of money when he was basically a teenager. And it wasn't viewed as weird for a 19-year-old to be meeting with a very powerful venture capitalist. And it's not because his daddy knew the venture capitalist. No. This is, you know, look, I will be very critical of the United States. But one thing I think we do well is we are willing to give young people enormous amounts of responsibility. And we are willing to take risks with young people and not put you at the bottom of a hierarchy and make you wait until you're 40 to have any authority. When I was running tech policy for the Obama campaign, I was like the oldest guy on the team. I was. I mean, this was a presidential campaign, a wildly innovative presidential campaign. And the people who were leading it were all in their 20s. So I do think that as a matter of culture, one thing that does need to change a little bit is I do think that we need to take the talents and ambitions of young people in France a little bit more seriously, and just saying you have a job, you're at the bottom of the hierarchy. Talk to you in 10 years.
Great. On peut applaudir. D'autres questions? Oui. Oui. Alors le micro. Where is the micro? Là-bas. Ah, il a volé le micro.
Hello.
OK.
Sorry, it'll be slightly political if you don't mind. Donald Trump on his campaign in 2016, he stated like jobs, 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 but it's clearly evident that in the future that all the jobs are being automated. So as we engineers, computer engineers, we are the ones who will be bringing that automation into the industry. So, but this will also lead a decrease in the jobs, like, you know, a lot of jobs will be off from the industries. So what do you think the government or any other government should do as a proposal to cover up the unemployment?
Yeah, so two things. So first, there has to be a safety net for people whose skills are now out of date. Look, humans are not as easy to update as software. You cannot plug us in the wall, turn on Wi-Fi, in an hour we have a new operating system. That's not how we work. So I do believe there is a safety net. If you are a 60-year-old truck driver and all of a sudden your truck is being driven autonomously, it's unreasonable to say to that 60-year-old, oh, you know what, we need coders. Go to coding school. It's not realistic. So I do believe in a safety net. If we're going to create all of this wealth and well-being, some of that should go to taxes, and some of those taxes should go to be as we are creating a new world, making sure that we aren't creating a world where people who don't have high-value skills have to live in poverty. That's thing one. Thing two, though, is on the preventative side of that, of education. As labor is being eliminated, new and varied forms of labor are being, new and varied forms of labor types are being created. So, you know, I've got equity. You know, I own stakes in like 7 or 8 startups. And our single biggest challenge in our startups is hiring talent. You know, we have, you know, in our companies, we pay 23-year-olds 150,000 euros all the time to get them in. And we work, and we're delighted to pay them because we have people who have needs for really strong technical skills in our companies. If you want to keep people from being displaced, what we have to do is increase the supply of people with skills that do map to where the job opportunities are going to be. We don't have a jobs deficit. We have a skills deficit. And so for people at points of their lives where they can still reskill, there needs to be opportunities for that, in my view.
Earlier on, you talked about America's culture of high risk. And I thought to myself, is America's culture of high risk has been a reason for why internet has been somewhat insecure? I know that, if I recall properly, France has also been a pioneer on the internet. They tried to create their own version of the internet in the past. And you said earlier that France's problem is that their lack of innovation and they don't like to take risk. And this is why I've heard that France took a lot of time to implement the concept of internet, while America took this idea and pretty much ran with it. Do you think that this reasoning is a reason why today the internet seems so insecure and have like many privacy problems?
Yeah, I think the culture of the internet is open and it's fast. And that is, look, that's one of its greatest strengths and it's one of its greatest weaknesses. You do not have to have a panel of men with gray hair deciding what goes on the internet or how the internet will work. It's been sort of a space for open innovation. What that has done is it's created spectacular things that we all benefit from today. But the flip side of that is, yeah, it's less secure than if it had been developed according to the French model in the 1980s, as stewarded by the bureaucrats and the academics. Given a choice, I would rather have a more open model, but I do believe that, now that we've built sort of this Wild West open model of the internet, the question becomes, how do we make it more secure? And in fact, there is a school of thought in the United States right now around the creation of Internet 2.0. If we do build a new internet, how can we make it more secure from the outset? The challenge is that the Chinese are planning the exact same thing. The problem, in my opinion, going back to the issue of privacy, is the Chinese model has basically 100% surveillance into it, and they say, oh, well, that makes it more secure. Well, yeah, it makes it more secure, but it also curtails our freedom. And so this balance between freedom and security is tricky. Freedom without security is fragile. Security without freedom is oppressive. How can you harmonize those? Given a choice between security and freedom, maybe it's just me, I tilt a little bit more towards freedom. That's my choice.
You can continue?
I'm done with that question. Oh, yeah.
We can continue? Okay, let's go. 1, 2, 3, 4.
Who's up? Yes, sir.
Hi. I have one question. It's about the Obama position on.
Put the microphone up.
Yeah. It's about Obama position on NASA space exploration. I want to know, what do you think of that position?
What Obama thought about NASA space exploration?
And his decision.
Okay, it's kind of there's actually a funny story there. So at the beginning of the campaign, I wasn't just in charge of technology and media policy. I was also in charge of science policy, because there weren't a lot of us. Like, we were a little startup. Barack Obama was this junior senator. He wasn't supposed to win. And I also had science. I'm not a scientist. And I was doing a debate with Hillary Clinton's, we were running against Hillary. And on tech and media, I knew I was going to kill him. But on science, I was worried. And one of the topics was NASA. And Obama, I've got to be aware there's a camera on. Obama didn't care much about space policy. He just didn't. And so I got creamed by the Hillary person on that question of space policy. But once he became president, he got more and more into it. He became more and more interested and more supportive of NASA. Now, having said all that, the most interesting stuff happening, in my opinion, in space policy and in space activity is actually not being driven by governments, it's being driven by the private sector, both philanthropically and commercially. I'm interested, there's this thing right now called Breakthrough Starshot. Have you heard of this? Which is, is an initiative started by a guy named Yuri Milner and a group of others to do very cutting-edge space exploration. And so what's different today than what was the case 10 years ago or any time before that is now space exploration is increasingly the realm of the private sector and individuals. The one way in which I'm a little bit critical of this, though, a lot of the people who are putting the most money into this are some of our biggest billionaires. And I do wish they would care a little bit more about what was happening on Earth relative to space. So they will put billions of dollars of philanthropy into space work. But I'm also kind of like, hey, there's a lot of homelessness, right around you. Might you be interested in focusing on that? It's just a little bit of a disconnect.
Hi, thank you very much, Alec, for being here. You agree that job will be an issue in the future, skills will be an issue in the future. Companies fear that disruption. Everyone fears the disruption. But I'm asking one question. Why does government not pay startups to invent the new jobs? Startups are inventing new technologies. They could add the ideas or how those technologies could be used, but why not using public money to ask them to invent that?
Yeah, I don't think that's the role of government. I would much rather have a strong venture capital sector than have government giving money to startups. Because with a venture capitalist, what you're getting is the discipline and the mentoring of, you're getting the discipline and the mentoring of the private sector. With government, it would be more like a grant or a loan. It would be more bureaucratic. And government isn't built to function like a market-based entity. Startups are players in the markets. They're inherently capitalistic. And so I say if you're going to get behind a capitalistic model like startups, then use capitalistic methods like venture capital to fuel it. I agree with you that startups are a spectacular engine for wealth creation, job creation, upward economic mobility. What I think is lacking here is not some government program to give startups money. What you need is a more robust venture capital community so that any of you with good ideas can get those ideas funded. So I would focus on venture capital before government.
One or two last questions? Okay.
Hi, we've talked a lot about technology today, and I wanted to know if as engineers we didn't have a duty to sort the problem, the ecological problem, knowing that today we have no returns on ecological problems, so no one is going to throw money into it. So I'd like to have your point of view on a possible solution to solve this problem.
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, it's interesting, I was in Lyon yesterday, and I was meeting with government officials, and their fear, they say because of climate change, the snow line keeps going up. You know, there's less snow in the Alps, and they're worried in 15 years that there's going to not be enough water to fuel the nuclear, for the nuclear power plant. I mean, these are huge challenges. If I were in your generation, if you were to say, what's the grand challenge? It's not building a new app. It's not creating a newer, faster, higher speed, lower cost internet connection. It is this question of what we are doing to our ecology, largely as a byproduct of climate change. I do think that there are approaches that you can take in the market. You know, can we create new sustainable technologies? Biomass, hydro, you know, whatever it is. I'm agnostic, I just want it to work. That could be done private sector, or as an engineer, you can focus on some of the public sector initiatives here. But if you are beginning your career and you want to focus on something that matters, I cannot think of one thing that matters more where you could apply your engineering skills, is to make sure not only do we have a better future, but that we have a future at all. Because I am really worried about it right now. You know, I remember having meetings, you know, when I was at the White House, where the scientists would come in and tell us what was happening. And then they would look at us, and these are like the best scientists in the world. Some, by the way, French. And they would say, oh, we of course only understand 20% of what's going on. Well, the 20% was scary. The 80% could be really scary. We just don't know. So if this is an area where you would like to apply your engineering skills, I can't think of anything you could do that would be more valuable. Last question?
Last question.
Hello, sir. At the beginning of your speech, you said that about like setting the rules. It's not always the more qualified one who will set it. And I'm pretty sure that we won't set rules for like internet in one shot, like in a perfect shot. So it will take years and years to build it perfectly. So can you think we can like make it almost perfect for everybody, like worldwide, in the next 50 years with companies such as the one you spoke about, like taking talents in Africa or in less developed countries?
Yeah, that's a great question. Look, I choose to be optimistic, and I choose to be optimistic because pessimists don't change the world. Pessimists don't change the world. Only optimists change the world. Pessimists critique the work of optimists. But pessimists don't actually change the world. You know, we can all stay in bed and curl into the fetal position and say, oh, it's terrible, nothing works. Our politicians are pigs, we're losing our privacy, oh, what are we going to do? Or you can assert yourself. And you can say, you know what? Maybe my parents' generation didn't leave a perfect world, but my generation is going to make it better than the last one. So yeah, I do believe that not being a pessimist, not curling into a ball, and coming up with really innovative solutions to big problems is the best thing that your generation can be doing. You mentioned the company in Africa. That makes me optimistic. It makes me optimistic. Part of why I do the venture capital work that I do is because the people who come see us every day have an idea, and to have an idea that you are willing to share and ask for money and be willing to spend years of your life doing, that is an act of optimism. That is an act of optimism. And what I would say, the last words I'll leave you with are actually the words of a president from 100 years ago, a guy named Teddy Roosevelt. And he said this. He said, "It is far better to dare mighty deeds, to win glorious triumphs, even though checkered by failure, than to rank with those poor spirits who neither enjoy much nor suffer much, because they live in a gray twilight that knows neither victory nor defeat." It's much better to take big risks and win big and lose big. I've won big and I've lost big. But what I don't want is to be in that gray twilight. I'd rather enjoy much and suffer much. And so that would be part of my closing advice to you all today. Thank you for that question. Thank you all for your time. And check out my book, The Industries of the Future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Le livre s'appelle, it's in French. It's in French, but it's advertising, so not problem. Le livre s'appelle Les Industries du Futur d'Alec Ross. Les éditions FIP. Alec signera un certain nombre de livres qui sont disponibles là-bas, si vous le souhaitez. Merci beaucoup. Et on peut l'applaudir une dernière fois.